The history of the First World War. The war that devoured nations, reshaped frontiers, and altered the course of human destiny, starts with one moment, one shot on a balmy summer afternoon in Sarajevo. But to get a handle on how this spark had the potential to ignite the whole world, we have to take a step back and view the powder keg of Europe in the early 20th century. A world on edge. Europe in 1914 was not peaceful. It was outwardly an era of culture, innovation, and advancement. Cities hummed with electricity, motor cars, and telephones. Authors and artists were probing new and daring ideas. Science was soaring to new levels, but under the sheen of modernity, there brewed political tensions like open sores. Since time immemorial, mighty empires had fought for hegemony. Britain dominated the seas with the world's most powerful navy. France, its wounds fresh from the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, kept a vigilant eye over its ambitious neighbor, Germany. That war had brought Germany not just victory but also new land, Alsace-Lorraine, a bitter defeat that France was eager to recover. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the other hand, was a jumble of nations: Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, and a host of others, all under one crown, but all desirous of independence. The Ottoman Empire, powerful in the past, was losing strength, its Balkan territories eroding. Amidst it all, unified for only a few years in 1871, Germany was climbing rapidly. Its economy was as great as Britain's, its army was strong, and its politicians fantasized about a German empire equal to Britain and France. This rivalry for dominance forged alliances, networks of assurances between countries that were designed to safeguard peace, but actually ensnared Europe in a perilous chain reaction. The alliance system too, mighty camps had emerged. On the one side was the Triple Entente, Britain, Russia, and France. On the other was the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy's allegiance was to prove unsteady. These alliances were loaded guns aimed at each other. If one country was attacked, the others were committed to defending it. Leaders thought that this balance of power would ensure peace, because no one would risk beginning a war against so many enemies simultaneously. But really, it meant that a small skirmish could quickly develop into something much bigger. The Balkan powder keg. If Europe was a powder keg, the Balkans were the match. This land, currently inhabited by nations such as Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and others, was intensely nationalist. Small states craved freedom from empires that oppressed them. Serbia, especially, envisioned unifying all Slavs under its banner, which posed an immediate threat to Austria-Hungary, whose empire had millions of Slavs. Austria-Hungary had already upset Serbia by annexing Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1908, lands Serbia felt ought to be included in a greater Slavic nation. Tensions ran high, and clandestine nationalist groups had started conspiring against the empire. One such Serbian group was the Black Hand, whose members felt violence was legitimized in their struggle for national liberty. Their intended target would soon be the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. A royal visit on the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the emperor's nephew and heir, went to the Bosnian city of Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. It was intended to be a ceremonial tour, an expression of imperial boasting, yet it was a taunting action. To numerous Serbs and Slavic nationalists, the Archduke was a symbol of oppression. His presence in Sarajevo, on the date marking a classic Serbian loss centuries before, seemed a provocation. Unknown to him, young plotters of the Black Hand lay hidden in the city, armed with pistols and grenades. The first attempt as the motorcade of the Archduke made its way through the city streets, an assassin appeared, and tossed a grenade. The bomb, however, fell short, striking the car, and exploding beneath the next one behind it, wounding several officers. Panic set in among the crowd. Police arrested the would-be assassin, and Franz Ferdinand rode on, shaken but untouched. At this juncture, he could have departed Sarajevo and escaped harm, but fate had other plans. A fatal wrong turn later that day, the Archduke demanded to go see the injured from the bombing at the hospital. The motorcade departed again, but the driver was not told that the trip was rerouted for security reasons. In error, he turned down a side street, right by a young man named Gavrilo Princip, who was another member of the Black Hand, just leaving a cafe. Princip couldn't believe his eyes. Archduke's automobile had come to a stop just in front of him, engine sputtering. Without hesitation, he brought out his pistol and shot twice. One bullet hit Sophie, the Duchess, in her stomach. Another hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Both were dead within a few minutes. Shockwaves through Europe. The news of the assassination spread like fire. It was not only a personal tragedy for Austria-Hungary, but a personal attack on the empire. Angered, Vienna's leaders condemned Serbia, asserting that the government had assisted the assassins. In punishment, they imposed an ultimatum that was so severe it was almost impossible to swallow. Serbia, supported by Russia, attempted to negotiate but rebuffed some of the most humiliating ultimata. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 28, 1914. The chain reaction started. The domino effect. Russia, adhering to Slavic solidarity and its entente with France, mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany, perceiving its ally Austria-Hungary in danger, issued a declaration of war against Russia. France was drawn in against Germany and Austria-Hungary. When Germany invaded Belgium to invade France, Britain went to war to defend Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, almost all of the great powers of Europe were at war. What had begun as a local Balkan conflict had escalated into a continental, and eventually global, war. Why did this one event matter so much? In retrospect, it's simple to ask, why did the loss of one man and his wife make the whole world go up in flames? The reality is, the assassination was merely the spark. The actual fuel was years of distrust, competition, and aspiration. The big powers had amassed huge militaries and made extensive war plans, awaiting a conflict they nearly anticipated. Politicians held the belief that it was survival by striking first, and so when the spark arrived, the powder keg ignited. A world plunged into darkness. By August 1914, trains were bringing millions of troops to the front. People cheered, hoping the war would be short and glorious. Men volunteered in large numbers, not yet grasping the horrors that lay ahead. The world had entered the abyss, and it all started with a mistaken turn down a Sarajevo street. When war was proclaimed in summer 1914, millions of men throughout Europe rejoiced on the streets. To them, it was an adventure, a prospect for glory, honor, and swift victory. Politicians assured citizens that the war would only last weeks. Newspapers wrote with enthusiasm, portraying the war as a chivalrous struggle. Troops marched with song on their lips, and civilians showered them with flowers. But this hope was founded on illusions. This war that was to be brief and glorious soon degenerated into something without precedent, a war of mud, steel, and unimagined horror. This would not be their father's war. This would be a different war altogether, a world of trenches and fright. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's gamble. Germany recognized that it was to fight two enemies, to the west France, and to the east Russia. In order not to fight both simultaneously, German leaders revived an old plan, the Schlieffen Plan. The plan was ruthless and ambitious. Germany would attack France first, marching through neutral Belgium, and seizing Paris in a matter of weeks. After France's defeat, Germany could turn east to confront Russia, which they felt would be slower to mobilize. The plan was implemented in August 1914. German forces flooded into Belgium, and overran the little but courageous Belgian army. The invasion stunned the world. Belgium had been neutral, and its breach drew Britain into the conflict. The Germans moved rapidly, but the resistance they encountered, from Belgian and British forces, was more robust than anticipated. By September, they were closing on Paris, but the French and British fought the line at the Battle of the Marne. In a last-ditch effort, Paris taxis were used to hurry soldiers to the front. The Germans were compelled to retreat. Their rapid victory plan had been foiled, the race to the sea. This was followed by what was termed the race to the sea. Each side attempted to flank the other, northward in an attempt to break through, but as soon as one side moved ahead, the other entrenched themselves, constructing trenches, barbed wire entanglements, and machine gun emplacements. By 1914's end, there was a permanent line of trenches along the way from the North Sea in Belgium to the Swiss border. Neither could gain an advantage. This marked the beginning of the bleak stalemate of the Western Front. Life in the trenches. The trenches emerged as the iconic symbol of World War I. Soldiers anticipated glory, What they experienced was mud, squalor and death. A standard trench was a 6 to 8 foot deep narrow ditch, supported by wooden planks and sandbags. Front-line trenches, support trenches, and reserve trenches existed, all linked with zigzagging approaches. Across from these trenches, a desolate cratered wasteland called No Man's Land stretched, dotted with barbed wire, broken trees, and the remains of the dead. Conditions inside were savage. When it rained, trenches became flooded, making the ground thick, adhesive mud that engulfed boots and jammed rifles. Trench foot, an excruciating condition, resulting from prolonged standing in freezing water. Afflicted soldiers, rats, belly rounded by gorging on the dead, infested the ditches. Uniforms were infested with lice, spreading disease. Sleeping was an exception, meals were cold and scarce, and the ringing of artillery reminded troops that death was never far off. Troop mail was precious, and soldiers held close to minor luxuries: a cigarette, a hot meal, or a picture of family. The new face of war. Since the dawn of history, wars had been waged with horseback charges, rifles and cannons. World War I brought a new and terrifying reality: industrialized killing. Machine guns spat out hundreds of bullets a minute, cutting down waves of charging troops. Huge guns fired shells miles into the air, and ripped landscapes apart with deafening explosions. Poison gas, introduced by the Germans in 1915, seared lungs and scorched eyes, and sent men screaming in agony. Old methods, such as charging boldly across open fields, were useless. Troops who attempted it were massacred in a matter of minutes. Generals, being slow to evolve, tended to make the same attacks, relying on sheer courage to carry the day. Instead, hundreds of thousands perished for a handful of yards of ground. The battles that defined the early War I, of the initial shocking fights, was the First Battle of Ypres in late 1914. Both forces endured enormous losses, yet neither advanced. The war became bogged down. The Second Battle of Ypres in 1915 introduced poison gas. Troops looked on in horror, as clouds of green chlorine spread across the battlefield, suffocating men to death. Gas masks soon followed, but fear of chemical warfare persisted. The 1916 Battle of Verdun would turn out to be one of the war's most protracted and bloodiest battles. The German objective was to bleed France white, by making enormous assaults to make the French invest resources in defense. Troops battled for 10 months in mud and blood. Verdun was a symbol of French resilience, with the battle cry, "They shall not pass." And then there was the Battle of the Somme, initiated by the British to take pressure off Verdun. On the very first day, July 1, 1916, Britain lost close to 60,000 men, the deadliest single day in its military history. By the end of the battle, over 1 million men had died or been wounded, and the front lines had hardly shifted. These initial battles uncovered the war's real character: killing on a factory scale, and not very much gained. The Eastern Front, a war of movement, while the Western Front bogged down in trenches. The war in the East was different. In the vast steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe, armies were able to move more freely. Battles were bigger, and the dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Russians advanced quicker than had been anticipated by Germany, and Germany was compelled to send troops to the east. Germany overwhelmed Russia at the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, taking more than 90,000 prisoners. But the Eastern Front was extensive, and though they won, Germany and Austria-Hungary could not keep it under control. Unlike the West, where the landscape was dominated by trenches, the East was a war of counterattack, retreat, and movement. But the gore was equally as horrifying. The illusion of over by Christmas. At home, the harsh reality of war finally seeped into people's consciousness. Families who had clapped their sons and husbands off to war now got telegrams with news of their sons' and husbands' deaths. Once bustling cities now became cities of mourning. The fantasy of a swift, glorious war had gone. At the end of 1914, Europe saw that it was stuck in a nightmare, a slow war of attrition that would take not weeks or months but years. Soldiers' perspectives for those in the trenches. The war was a combination of horror, dullness and fleeting moments of humanity. There were stretches of waiting, fixing trenches, letter writing, cleaning guns,
punctuated suddenly by grisly artillery bombardments or calls to go over the top. When the whistles blew, men scrambled up ladders from their trenches and charged through no man's land into machine gun and shell fire. Few returned alive, but even in this nightmare, there were ways in which soldiers adapted. They laughed, sang, and told each other stories. Some wrote drawings or poems, recording the bizarre combination of desperation and friendship, and occasionally then, humanity pierced the gloom, such as during the legendary Christmas truce of 1914, when troops on both sides had dropped their rifles, exchanged presents, and even had a game of football. The war goes global by 1915. The war was extending outside of Europe. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the Middle East, opening up new fronts. The Allies began the Gallipoli campaign, in an attempt to drive the Ottomans out of the war, and establish a supply route to Russia. Instead, it was another disaster, and both sides suffered heavy losses. Colonial forces from Africa and Asia were pulled into the war. Indian, Senegalese, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand soldiers were engaged in battles distant from home. World War I was no longer exclusively Europe's war. It was the world's. The end of illusions. At the end of 1915, it was evident this wasn't the war anyone had envisioned. The optimism of August 1914 no longer existed. A grim determination instead descended upon nations. Governments demanded more soldiers, more weapons and more sacrifices. The term "the war to end all wars" caught on, not because individuals thought it would be noble, but because they could not envision human civilization facing another war of this nature ever again. But the war had only just begun. The years that followed would produce even greater devastation, more advances in killing, and more misery than the world had ever experienced. The Great War had officially commenced. When people think of World War I, the image that often comes to mind is the muddy trenches of France, soldiers in helmets crouching in the cold rain, artillery thundering endlessly. But the truth is much bigger. What began as a European crisis grew into a truly global war, involving colonies, empires, and distant battlefields that stretched across nearly every continent. The world had never seen anything like it. Europe's empires, and the global web. By 1914, a large part of the world was dominated by the great European empires. India was ruled by Britain, most of Africa, and Pacific territories. France controlled North and West Africa colonies, Indochina, and Caribbean and Pacific islands. Germany, although a relatively recent starter in empire building, held African and Pacific territories. When war broke out in Europe, these colonies were automatically involved. They were not only suppliers of raw materials, food, metals, rubber, oil, but also sources of soldiers. Millions of men from Africa, Asia, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand would soon fight in battles far away from home. It wasn't just Europe's war, it was the world's. Africa, a continent at war. Africa, carved up by European powers in the late 19th century, became one of the first regions where World War I spread. German colonies in Africa. Germany held colonies in Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, today Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and German Southwest Africa, Namibia. The Allies quickly moved to attack these territories. British and French forces seized Togoland within weeks. In Cameroon, the conflict raged for more than a year, as soldiers fought not just with each other, but also with swamps, disease and oppressive heat. In German East Africa, the war became a guerrilla campaign, waged by the wily General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. With his handful of men, he kept hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers occupied, refusing to be captured until the end of the war in 1918. African troops in Europe. In addition to local combat, African troops were transported overseas to Europe. France drew extensively from its colonial forces, importing soldiers from Senegal, Morocco and Algeria, to fight in the Western Front trenches. The men, who had little experience with the cold and savagery of trench life, fought valiantly, but endured miserably nonetheless. The African campaigns demonstrated this was not merely Europe's war. The conflict had now engaged whole continents. Asia, and the Pacific halfway around the world from Europe. The war also extended into the Pacific Ocean and Asia. Japan enters the war. Japan and Britain allied and declared war on Germany in August 1914. Its motive was not only loyalty but opportunity. Japan rapidly captured German-controlled territories in China, such as the port city of Qingdao, and took over Germany's Pacific Islands, the Marshalls, Carolines and Marianas. For Japan, the war was an opportunity to expand its presence in Asia, paving the way for its emergence as a global power in the 20th century. India's colossal contribution. Britain relied heavily on India for manpower. More than 1.3 million Indian soldiers and workers contributed to the war effort, serving in France, the Middle East, and Africa. Indian soldiers braved the bitter winters of the Western Front and blistering deserts of Mesopotamia. Some were promised increased political rights in India as a reward for their service, something that would later be used to bolster independence movements. The Middle East, a new front. One of the most theatrically dramatic war stages in the world was the Middle East. The erstwhile powerful but then weakening Ottoman Empire allied with the Central Powers in the last days of 1914. By doing so, it introduced enormous new theaters of war, deserts, holy cities, and ancient lands to be forged into the modern Middle East. The Gallipoli Campaign. The Allies sought to strike the Ottomans quickly by forcing their way through the Dardanelles Strait, capturing Constantinople, Istanbul, and opening a supply route to Russia. The result was the ill-fated Gallipoli Campaign of 1915. Troops from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand, the famous Anzacs, landed on the rocky beaches of Gallipoli, but the Ottomans, led by an emerging officer named Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey, fought hard. The campaign became a standoff of cliffs, trenches and harsh conditions. The Allies retreated after 8 months and high losses. Gallipoli was a debacle but a national identitarian moment for Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey as well. The Arab revolt simultaneously. In Arabia's deserts, there was another drama. Arab leaders, who were angered by the Ottoman rule, rebelled with Britain's backing. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, and his sons, as well as the legendary British officer T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, made guerrilla raids on Ottoman railways and garrisons. Their fight for freedom was linked to clandestine promises by the Allies, promises post-war to cause controversy when the Middle East was carved up under British and French rule. The war at sea. While armies fought on land, domination of the seas was equally vital. Britain's naval blockade. Britain's Royal Navy was the strongest in the world, and used that strength to blockade Germany. By interrupting supplies of food, fuel, and raw materials, Britain believed that it could starve Germany into submission. The blockade was ruinous, leading to drastic shortages and starvation among the German people. German U-boats. Germany retaliated with an instrument of terror that frightened the world, the U-boat, or submarine. These quiet ships stalked the Atlantic and torpedoed Allied merchant vessels. In 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the British passenger ship Lusitania, and over 1,200 died, including Americans. Indignation swept worldwide, and although the United States did not yet join the war, the attack sowed seeds of rage that would one day turn the tide. The Battle of Jutland. The war's biggest naval battle was in 1916, at the Battle of Jutland between Germany and Britain. The battle was intense and bloody but indecisive. Britain controlled the seas, allowing the blockade to continue, and Germany's surface fleet was largely confined to port for the remainder of the conflict. The Americas. Even distant from the front, the Americas were not immune. Latin America. Most of the Latin American nations eventually joined the Allies, breaking relations with Germany after repeated attacks from U-boats. Brazil even dispatched naval units to assist in patrolling the Atlantic. The United States, watching and waiting. During the early years, America was neutral. President Woodrow Wilson asked Americans to remain outside of Europe's conflict, but neutrality was not indifference. American munition factories sold arms and ammunition to the Allies, and attacks by German submarines on American shipping gradually wore away patience. When in 1917, Germany reinstated unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any vessel headed for Britain, with or without passengers, and when the notorious Zimmermann telegram disclosed Germany's effort to induce Mexico to attack the U.S., America could no longer remain passive. Before long, America would enter the war, shifting the balance of international power, colonial soldiers and their legacy, and possibly the most underrepresented of all these contributions is that of colonial troops. Over 1 million men from India, hundreds of thousands from Africa, entire divisions from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, volunteers and laborers from the Caribbean and Pacific Islands. These soldiers fought gallantly, frequently in conditions far worse than anything they had previously experienced, but following the war, they returned home to discover little reward or recognition. Nevertheless, their involvement sowed seeds of change. The war revealed the hypocrisy of empires that lectured of freedom while holding colonies under domination. Movements demanding independence throughout Asia and Africa would become more powerful in ensuing years. A truly global conflict. By 1916, war map extended over continents, trenches along France and Belgium, mountain warfare between Austria-Hungary and Italy, desert wars in Mesopotamia and Arabia, guerrilla wars in Africa, naval warfare in the Atlantic and Pacific. No other war in history had ever been waged on so large a scale. The First World War had become precisely that, a world war, the weight of the world for common people in distant countries. The war was far away and agonizingly near. Indian farmers cultivated grain that fed French soldiers. Senegalese families wept for sons who were killed in frozen European trenches. Australian mothers got telegrams informing them boys had been killed at Gallipoli. The war gave a reminder to mankind that in a world connected by empires and commerce, no country could stay completely alone. A war without borders. By mid-war, it was obvious that the conflict would not be confined. Each ocean, each continent, each colony had been reached in some manner, from Africa's jungles to the deserts of the Middle East, from the Pacific's islands to American factories. The war had become the first genuinely global disaster, and yet, through all this blood and sacrifice, the world was merely halfway through its nightmare. The worst was still to come. When the war initially started, most young men envisioned it as an adventure of sorts, an opportunity to fight for glory, wear the uniform proudly, and return home as a winner. But when they reached the front, the situation was something entirely different from the posters, something different from the promises. The truth was trenches, long, muddy gashes across the face of the land that devoured millions of men for years on end. The birth of the trenches. By December 1914, it was apparent the war would not be brief. Germany's Schlieffen Plan had failed, and early battles resulted in bloody standoffs, compelling both armies to entrench. Shallow rifle pits initially created soon developed into complex trench systems that extended almost 475 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. These trenches were not temporary. They were designed to last for years of war. The soldiers dug them into the ground with shovels, lined them with sandbags, wooden boards and corrugated tin, and developed a system of defenses that was both a protection and a prison. The design of a trench. A trench system was more than a single ditch. It was a maze. Front-line trenches nearest to the enemy, barely 50, 100 yards away in some areas. Here the soldiers stood watch, made assaults and weathered bombardments. Support trenches, behind the front line where reinforcements, ammunition and medical care were brought up. Reserve trenches, further in the rear, where soldiers could rest, although rest was seldom quiet with artillery echoing in the distance. The trenches cut across each other in a zigzag pattern rather than following a straight course. In this manner, if the enemy took over one part, they were unable to shoot down the length of it. In between the trenches lay no man's land, a barren stretch of mud, wire, broken trees and bodies. It was often lethal to cross. The muddy hell. Quite possibly the biggest foe in the trenches wasn't shells or bullets, but mud, rain made the ground a sucking swamp that swallowed boots, guns, even men whole. The soldiers marched through it every day, uniforms heavy and dripping. In winter, mud congealed into jagged ridges that ripped at hands and knees. In summer, it rolled over with stench and death. The mud introduced disease. Trench foot, a result of extended time spent in cold, damp weather, made soldiers' feet rot to the point that they were black. Unchecked, it progressed to gangrene and amputation. Officers instructed men to switch socks and apply whale oil to their feet, but prevention was nearly impossible in the chaos of war. Rats, lice, and disease, life of the worst sort infested the trenches. Rats as big as cats ran about unimpeded, eating off corpses buried in shallow trenches or left uneaten in no man's land. The soldiers spoke of rats chewing on their rations, their boots, even their sleeping friends. Lice plagued men day and night, inhabiting the folds of uniforms. Regardless of how regularly soldiers attempted to clean, the lice invariably came back, inducing non-stop itching and spreading trench fever, a debilitating illness characterized by rashes, headaches, and fatigue. Flies buzzed in summer, attracted by the smell of rot. Added to poor hygiene and dirty water, they caused dysentery, leaving soldiers weak and dry. The battlefield was just as much a fight against nature as it was against the enemy.
Daily life in the trenches. Trench life, although chaotic, had a rhythm to it. Stand to. When morning and evening dawned, soldiers made themselves ready for enemy attacks, as these were the prime times that attacks would be launched. Maintenance. When not engaged in fighting, soldiers maintained trenches, strengthened walls, pumped out water, and new barbed wire was laid down. Waiting. Endless hours of tedium came next. Men whiled away the time with letters, cards, or whittling tiny keepsakes from shell casings or pieces of wood. Fear and shell fire. Instantly boredom gave way to fear when shells started falling. Ground trembled, sky flashed, and men huddled in dugouts, hoping the next would miss them. Monotony was interrupted by flashes of sheer frenzy, and the fear was ever present. Going over the top. The worst command a soldier might receive was over the top. On signal of a whistle, soldiers ascended ladders from their trenches and advanced through no man's land towards enemy trenches. Machine guns were in wait, shells descended. Barbed wire ensnared men in the open, where they were slaughtered in an instant. Casualties were ghastly. Whole battalions were annihilated in a matter of minutes, and victories were counted in yards, not miles. Soldiers said it was a nightmare. The ear-splitting explosion of shells, the screams of wounded men, the sight of comrades dropping one by one. Shell shock. The psychological cost of trench warfare was appalling. Soldiers who weathered non-stop bombardments experienced what was then referred to as shell shock. Symptoms were trembling, nightmares, paralysis, and uncontrollable panic. It was viewed as cowardice by some commanders at the time. Men were court-martialed for not fighting, even killed. But today we view it as an early assessment of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. For many, the war did not end. Even when they made it home, the sounds of artillery rang in their heads. The small comforts. In the midst of the horror, soldiers held on to small comforts. Letters from home. Getting a letter from home might restore a man's morale more than rest or food. Others read them repeatedly, until the paper was in shreds. Food and cigarettes. Rations were simple. Bully beef, tinned corned beef, bread, biscuits, and tea. Cigarettes were a luxury as much a necessity as food, soothing nerves, and wilding away time. Comradeship. Fundamentally, soldiers depended on one another. Friendships developed in the trenches were powerful and indestructible. Men who shared their life and death had something few could comprehend. This comradeship provided soldiers the resilience to continue when everything else appeared lost. The Christmas truce. One of the most incredible moments of the war occurred in December 1914. Christmas Eve saw soldiers along sections of the Western Front lay down their arms. They sang Christmas carols, shouted Merry Christmases, and even ventured into no man's land. The following morning, British and German troops shook hands, exchanged gifts, and played football with each other. For an instant, humanity pierced the gloom of war. The ceasefire didn't last long. Officers soon sent soldiers back into battle, but the memory remained. a reminder that even amidst the mud and blood of war, peace was a reality. The medical struggle. The trenches posed new challenges to medicine. Wounds. Shrapnel and bullets inflicted ruinous wounds. Mud tended to infect wounds, causing fatal gangrene. Stretcher bearers. Daring men endangered their lives to take wounded soldiers back from no man's land under fire. Field hospitals. Close to the trenches, temporary hospitals patched up as many as they could, but supplies were stretched to the limit. Surgeons pioneered new methods in surgery and infection prevention that would one day redefine modern medicine. The scale of the casualties necessitated innovation, but at the cost of millions of men who never returned home. The soldier's perspective. Trench life was mixed based on the soldier's background. Officers occasionally enjoyed dugouts with slightly improved conditions, but regular soldiers had it the worst. However, in terms of rank, everybody was affected. Diaries and letters preserve their voices. We live like rats, and the rats live like kings. The earth shakes, and the sky screams. I no longer fight for king or country. I fight for the men beside me. In what they say we see the truth of war not depicted in propaganda posters. A life between hell and humanity. The trenches represented the irony of World War I. They were on the one hand sites of unimaginable suffering, mud, blood, fear and death. They were on the other hand, sites of the strength of the human spirit, in friendship, in laughter, in determination to survive another day. For 4 years of grueling duration, millions of young men dwelled and perished in those ditches. They came in as boys pursuing glory, but came out, if they returned, as men forever altered. The shadow beyond the trenches. By 1916, trench warfare had become the characterizing image of the Western Front. The world was aghast as battles such as Verdun and the Somme devoured entire armies. Thousands died every day to take yards of ground. The trenches revealed to the world that this was not the war they were anticipating. It was not swift. It was not glorious. It was a war of survival, exhaustion, and attrition. The soldiers in the trenches carried the brunt of it all, and their accounts are still some of the most chilling in human history. Prior to 1914, wars had been savage, but they still played by rules people could comprehend. Soldiers used rifles, cavalrymen still charged over fields, and cannons blasted from afar. Generals thought courage and discipline could win battles, but the First World War destroyed these illusions. It was a laboratory of annihilation, where technologies made killing mechanical, industrial, and ghastly. It was the first time the machinery of the industrial age was used in full fury on human bodies. The outcome, the Great War was not only fought, it was built, made and multiplied by machines. Machine guns, the great equalizer. The worst nightmare of the trenches was the machine gun. During previous wars, a soldier might manage to shoot 10 rounds a minute from a bolt-action rifle, but the machine gun put an end to that. With water-cooled and belt-fed ammunition, weapons like the German MG-08 or British Vickers could shoot 400, 600 rounds per minute. A wall of bullets there was no stopping. Cavalry charges, once the pride of armies, were slaughtered instantly. Waves of soldiers going over the top fell in heaps within seconds. It didn't matter how brave you were, courage could not outrun lead. Generals were slow to grasp how lethal machine guns really were. Again and again they sent men into open fields, only to see whole divisions wiped out. The machine gun became the grim icon of modern warfare, impersonal, efficient and ruthless. Artillery, the thunder of war. If machine guns dominated the front lines, artillery dominated the horizon. Gigantic guns, some of which could fire shells more than 70 miles, dominated the landscape. The rhythmic rumble of bombardment became the war's background noise. Men said it was like living in a world where the sky itself was crashing down. Shells did not only kill, they remolded the ground. Fields turned into craters. Woods were left with toothpick stumps. Villages disappeared in dust clouds. Bombardments were frightening for soldiers. They huddled in trenches while the earth vibrated fiercely, helpless to move, expecting the shell that could bury them alive. Artillery caused most of the casualties of the war. It didn't care about anything. A fortunate shell could blow up a trench, a dugout, or even whole regiments with one explosion. Poison gas, the invisible killer. The most notorious horror of the Great War was poison gas. The first widespread application came in 1915, During the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces let loose canisters of chlorine gas, and a greenish-yellow cloud blew along Allied lines. Soldiers caught off guard struggled for air, as the chlorine seared their lungs, the very air made into a weapon. New gases soon followed, phosgene, more lethal than chlorine, leading to suffocation after an extended period. Mustard gas, the most dreaded of all, it did not kill immediately, but blistered, blinded and burned terribly. Men lived through mustard gas, but were scarred for the rest of their lives. Gas masks were provided, but they were incomplete protection, particularly at the start of the war. Soldiers feared gas attacks, the deadly creeping fogs that might come without warning, compelling them to rush for masks in a few seconds. Gas warfare was banned after the war, but in World War I, it became the ultimate symbol of how technology had stripped away humanity. Tanks, the beasts of war. By 1916, both sides were desperate to break the stalemate of the trenches. Britain unveiled a new invention, the tank. At first they appeared to be near humorous, great metal containers on caterpillar treads, creeping slowly across the battlefield at only 3 miles per hour, but their psychological impact was as great as their physical one. Tanks could smash barbed wire, roll over trenches, and survive machine gun fire. The first major deployment was during the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. Some broke down or became mired in the mud, but those that made it to enemy trenches frightened German troops, who had not witnessed such vehicles before. By 1917 and 1918, the tanks were upgraded. Hundreds of British tanks led the attack at the Battle of Cambrai, demonstrating the possibilities of mechanized warfare. Although primitive, tanks were where things were heading, looking toward the armored warfare of World War II. The air war, from balloons to aces. When hostilities started, airplanes were a novelty, cumbersome devices made of wood and canvas. Initially, they were only employed for reconnaissance, detecting enemy movements and guiding artillery fire. Men soon equipped them with pistols, rifles, and later synchronized machine guns that fired through the propeller. This is how the fighter plane came into being. The skies over the trenches became dueling grounds. Fabled pilots, the aces were heroes. None more renowned than Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who downed 80 Allied aircraft before he was killed in 1918. And then came the bombers, releasing bombs on trenches, supply centers and even cities. Primitive compared to subsequent wars, the air war was the initial flavor of a new battlefield. The sky, war at sea, the U-boat menace. At sea, new horrors floated beneath the water. The German U-boat, literally, Unterseeboot, was among the most dreaded weapons of the war. Submarines differed from surface vessels in that they could attack unseen. They patrolled shipping routes, sinking merchant ships with torpedoes. Britain, reliant on imports from abroad, came near to starvation as U-boats destroyed thousands of tons of food and raw materials. In 1915, the world was shocked by the sinking of the Lusitania. The German torpedo struck the passenger ship, killing almost 1,200 civilians, including Americans. Anger spread across the Atlantic, moving the United States toward war. Convoys, a series of merchant ships escorted by warships, were used by the Allies to counter the U-boats. Yet the submarine had irreversibly changed naval warfare. Flamethrowers, grenades, and new horrors. Aside from the great innovations, the war also introduced scores of lesser but dreadful inventions. Flamethrowers, deployed by German soldiers to flush out trenches with bursts of flame. The mere sight was sufficient to drive foes in terror. Hand grenades, basic but lethal, hurled into dugouts to slay men underground. Trench mortars, small but mobile artillery, that fired shells directly into enemy trenches. Each invention appeared to be created to make life in the trenches even more miserable. Industrial war, it was not only their design that made these weapons so lethal, it was their scale. Factories ran day and night, producing guns, shells, and planes by the million. Science and industry, which had once been the symbols of progress, were used to create destruction. The same modern era that produced automobiles and electricity produced poison gas and machine guns. War was for the first time total war. All sectors of society were mobilized to kill.
Civilians worked in factories producing munitions. Scientists invented more lethal weapons. Whole economies were subordinated to the demands of the battlefield. The psychological effect. The new technology of World War I killed but also transformed the way soldiers perceived war itself. The machine gun stole from men the notion that courage could conquer firepower. The artillery shell instilled a perpetual feeling of hopelessness. Death could drop from the air at any second. The gas attack made the very air hostile. The tank and airplane foreshadowed a future where machines would reign supreme on the battlefield, making men into pawns. For most soldiers, these weapons deprived war of any nobility. It was no longer a battle of men, but a slaughterhouse operated by machines. Voices from the front diaries and letters preserve the horror of these new horrors. One French soldier wrote, "The machine guns cut us down like wheat before a scythe." A British officer explained artillery, "We live in a world of noise. The shells do not stop day or night. The ground itself trembles." A German soldier remembered a gas attack. "We saw the green cloud drifting toward us. Our lungs burned, our eyes blinded. Men fell screaming. It was not war. It was the end of the world." These voices remind us that behind every invention were human lives destroyed. The legacy of new terrors. By 1918, World War I weapons had reshaped the face of war. The cavalry charge was a thing of the past. Sword-carrying officers were relics. The battlefield was the domain of machines, chemicals, and steel. The war was over, but the impact of these innovations continued. Tanks would rule World War II, airplanes would be inescapable, submarines would stalk oceans for decades to come, and perhaps most eerie of all, the threat of employing science to manufacture mass devastation would clear the way for even more malevolent weapons in the future. A war transformed. The Great War started with bayonets, horses, and visions of glory. It concluded with tanks, poison gas, and a generation traumatized by learning that technology, once a symbol of advancement, had itself become an instrument of horror. This was no longer merely war, it was terror mechanized. If we reflect on World War I, the first picture that comes to mind tends to be soldiers in dirty trenches. However, the war was not merely waged on the battlefields. It extended into the kitchens, factories, schools, and streets of all the countries involved. It was the first real total war, a war where entire societies, not merely armies, were marshaled. Civilians at a distance from the trenches learned that they were also soldiers in their own right. A world turned upside down with a declaration of war. In 1914, life turned around overnight. Towns that previously rang with music, cafes, and bazaars reverberated with marching feet and worried murmurs. Trains took millions of young men to the front, leaving hollow houses and anxious loved ones behind. Initially, most civilians rejoiced. Parades marched through the streets, flags fluttered, propaganda assured a speedy and triumphant victory. But when weeks grew into months, and months into years, optimism gave way. The war crept into every aspect of ordinary life. Rationing, the empty table, one of the first and most bitter changes arrived on the dinner plate. With German U-boats sinking ships, and war interrupting farms, foodstuffs became scarce. Governments instituted systems of rationing to ensure that everyone had something to eat. Families received ration books for bread, sugar, meat, and butter. In Britain, the populace learned to make meals go further with substitutes, powder eggs, milk, water, and bread, made from whatever grain was on hand. In Germany, the blockade had disastrous shortages. Turnips, which were normally used to feed livestock, were a food staple. Winter 1916-1917 was referred to as the turnip winter, when families got by on mere turnip soup. Mothers became experts at making a meal out of almost nothing. Children went to bed hungry. Long lines formed outside bakeries, with no guarantee food would still be available by the time one reached the counter. Food became a weapon of war, and hunger marched alongside soldiers. Propaganda. The war at your door. Governments recognized morale was equal to weaponry. They let loose a deluge of propaganda, posters, newspapers, movies, and tunes, to make sure citizens remained loyal to the cause. Posters featured courageous soldiers advancing into battle, calling men to enlist. Others stigmatized those who did not, with signs such as "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" Women were urged to pressure husbands and sons into service. At school, children learned patriotic songs. At the cinema, battles were glorified. Even fashion changed, with women knitting socks and scarves to support our boys at the front. Propaganda also labeled the enemy as evil. Germans were shown in Britain and France as Huns, ruthless, savage and monstrous. These stereotypes ignited fear and hatred, legitimating sacrifices at home. Women at work, a new role. The most striking transformation on the home front was the women's role. As millions of men went off to fight, women took on jobs they never had before. They worked in shell factories, assembling the very shells that boomed at the front. They drove trams, buses, were clerks, and even policewomen. Women in Britain known as munitionettes, manned factories, their faces and hands stained yellow from chemicals. It was hazardous work. Factory explosions killed scores of people. Illness was caused by exposure to chemicals, but women toughed it out, aware that their work helped feed the war machine. Women also served as nurses, caring for injured soldiers in field hospitals. Others volunteered with voluntary aid groups, driving ambulances or manning supply depots. For women, the war was a taste of economic independence for the first time. As the war ended, some went back to traditional roles, but the experience sowed seeds of change. Women's contribution to the war effort was a strong argument in favor of women's suffrages. In many countries, including Britain and America, women achieved the right to vote shortly after the war. Children of the war children also were caught up in the war effort. Schools organized scrap metal, rubber, and even fruit stones collections, which were applied to the production of gas mask filters. Boys were drilled in cadet uniforms, waiting for the time they could join the army. Girls learned how to nurse, knit and be frugal at home, but the children had a cost too. Many of them grew up without fathers or older brothers, either fighting at the front or dead on the battlefield. Frontline letters were treasured, read aloud by candlelight, then secreted away under pillows. In London, Paris and Berlin, children too were living under the threat of air bombing. Zeppelins and bombers from the Germans dropped war from above, killing civilians in their own homes. Children now knew for the first time in history that even far from the trenches, they could not be safe. Grief and waiting. The most difficult task for families was uncertainty. Each knock on the door, each letter from the postman may herald awful news. A son dead at Verdun, a father dead at Gallipoli, a brother lost in the Somme mud. There were millions of families in Europe who hung black cloths over their doors, mourning symbols which increased with each year. Widows had to raise children by themselves. Old parents plowed fields without their sons. An entire generation was marred by loss. For many, the war existed in incessant waiting, waiting for a letter, waiting for the war to be over, waiting for someone who never came back. Strikes and unrest. Life on the home front was not always loyal and quiet, despite patriotic propaganda. In Austria, Hungary and Germany, civilians were propelled into protesting by hunger. Food riots erupted as shortages increased. In Russia, discontent with the war coupled with poverty contributed to igniting the Russian Revolution of 1917. Streets were filled with crowds, rioting and calling for bread, peace and land. Months later, the Tsar had been deposed. In France and Britain, strikes broke out in factories as workers insisted on improved pay and working conditions. Governments suppressed them but also conceded, not wanting revolutions to spill over. The war wasn't just fought between countries, it was fought within societies, between the urgent need to survive and government demands. Civilians under occupation for civilians trapped in occupied territories. The war created a different nightmare. In northern France and Belgium, German occupation translated into curfews, food requisitioning, forced labor, and fear. Villages were deprived of assets, families were torn apart, resistance combatants risked brutal punishment if captured. Civilians adapted to survival in secrecy, concealing what little they owned and living beneath humiliation under foreign domination. The global home front. As the combat reached across continents, so did the home front. In India, not just soldiers but food and supplies were sent by families. Some felt that supporting Britain could lead to more independence once the war ended. In Africa, colonial subjects were compelled to work, constructing roads and hauling supplies for European forces. In Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, families existed in fear, as casualty lists mounted, especially after such battles as Gallipoli and the Somme. The war reached every doorstep, however distant from the trenches. Hope in adversity, but even in adversity, civilians managed to persevere. Neighborhoods held concerts, dances and fundraisers to boost morale. Newspapers carried tales of ministers and priests preached resilience. In Britain, King George V toured factories and hospitals, boosting national morale. In France, Marshal Joffre became a symbol of national quiet strength. Even in Germany, where there was widespread hunger, civilians held on to the hope that their own sacrifices would eventually lead to peace. The cost of total war. By 1918, 4 years of sacrifice had left civilians drained, cities had been bombed, families were destroyed, hunger gnawed whole nations. The home front was another battlefield, one fought with empty bellies, unspoken tears, and unyielding patience. When finally the guns fell quiet on November 11, 1918, it was all a relief, but the marks were left. Widows, millions of them, orphans, millions of them, all who had given their all, only to be granted a peace that seemed unreliable. A war fought by all. The history of World War I is not just about soldiers and generals. It is also about mothers who economized on bread, women who constructed shells, children who matured prematurely, and civilians who sustained loss beyond computation. The trenches were the front line, but the home front was the line of the heart. Without it, the war would not have been sustained. World War I was the first war to demonstrate that when countries go to war, everyone, soldiers and civilian, is drafted into its cause. By 1917, the world had been at war for almost 3 years. Millions dead, millions more injured. The trenches seemed to go on forever. Battles devoured whole armies, and yet the front lines had barely budged. The great powers were tired, their people hungry, their soldiers shattered. Their people hungry, their soldiers shattered. The war appeared infinite, until two massive events altered the situation. Russia fell apart, and America joined the war. Combined, these developments turned the war on its head, and brought the world closer to its end. The exhaustion of 1917. Prior to discussing these turning points, it is essential to see how the state of the war was by early 1917. On the Western Front, both armies were unable to shatter the deadlock. Verdun and the Somme of 1916 had drained armies white, without a deciding result. Troops now referred to the front lines as the meat grinder. In the east, Russia's armies had been decimated. Millions of Russian soldiers were inadequately armed, some going into combat without rifles, instructed to take up guns from dead comrades. At sea, Britain's blockade was suffocating Germany, starving its civilians and making them malnourished. German U-boats roamed the Atlantic, sinking vessels and infuriating neutral countries. On the home fronts, there were strikes, riots and protests throughout Europe. The turnip winter in Germany had starved families. France witnessed mutinies among its troops following unsuccessful offensives. Each country was at the point of breaking. Something had to give. The Russian Revolution, collapse of an empire for Russia. The breaking point came first. The Russian Empire had entered the war in 1914 with the largest army in the world, but sheer numbers could not overcome poor leadership, outdated equipment,
and fragile supply lines. As the war dragged on, the Russian people suffered. Bread was scarce, factories were overwhelmed, and soldiers were demoralized. In March of 1917, the tension boiled over into revolution. Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, workers and soldiers struck, calling for bread and a stop to the war. The demonstrations massed into a force that brought down Tsar Nicholas, ending centuries of Romanov dynasty rule. A provisional government seized power, making promises of reforms and continuing the war. But the Russian people wanted to stop fighting. When soldiers were commanded to make new attacks, they refused, sometimes leaving the front entirely. Later that year, in November 1917, the Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Lenin, took over in the October Revolution. In contrast to the provisional government, they made promises of peace, land and bread. Russia exits the war. One of Lenin's more important early actions was to make peace with Germany. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was concluded. Russia dropped out of the war, ceding vast territories in Eastern Europe, such as Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic republics. For Germany, it was a triumph. No longer required to battle on two fronts, they were able to shift divisions from the east to the west. At least theoretically, this provided Germany with one final opportunity to defeat the war, before the Allies increased in power. But whereas Germany acquired territory, it also acquired a deadly delusion, the idea that victory was within reach. America enters the war. As Russia was crumbling, another giant was awakening on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States was officially neutral from 1914 to 1917. President Woodrow Wilson asked Americans to avoid Europe's conflicts, calling it a war over there. But neutrality was not indifference. American factories sold weapons, food and supplies to the Allies, and the bond between the US and Britain was solidifying. Two events propelled America into war. Unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany said, in early 1917, that it would start sinking any ships going to Britain, no matter what country they were from. That left American ships open to being sunk without warning. Within a matter of months, some U.S. ships had been sunk, infuriating the public. The Zimmermann telegram. In January 1917, the British intercepted a clandestine German telegram to Mexico. In it, Germany offered to assist Mexico in reclaiming Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico in return for Mexico's entry into the war against the United States. When the telegram became public, Americans were outraged. On April 6, 1917, America declared war on Germany. The American army, from small to mighty. America's initial army was small, fewer than 200,000 men, but the United States had vast industrial and human resources. The Selective Service Act was enacted, and millions of young men were conscripted within a matter of months. General John J. Pershing commanded the newly established American Expeditionary Forces AEF to Europe. Initially, American soldiers were lightly engaged, treading gaps and offering morale boosts. However, as 1918 dawned, their strength increased, and their renewed vigor was badly needed. For weary Allied soldiers, the Yanks' arrival was a turning point. The answer coming was more than a song. It was an assurance of hope.
Germany's desperate gamble. Now that Russia had dropped out of the war and America was still mobilizing, Germany felt that it had a slim opportunity to emerge victorious. They mounted a huge series of attacks in the spring of 1918 called the Spring Offensive or Kaiserschlacht, Jobel Kaiser's Battle. For the first time in years, German lines broke through Allied lines. They moved deep into France, even threatening Paris. The Germans advanced quickly, employing stormtrooper tactics, small mobile units that went around strong points to strike deep behind enemy lines. At first it looked like it could be done. But Germany had pushed too far. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, their troops weary. The Allies reassessed, supported by newly arriving American divisions. By summer, Germany's advance had stopped. The tide turns. On July 1918, during the Second Battle of the Marne, the Allies launched a counterattack. With American soldiers now engaged in full strength, the German push was halted. From this moment on, the Allies took the initiative. During the Battle of Amiens, in August 1918, tanks, air power, and artillery operated in conjunction with infantry, in what was referred to as the 100 Days Offensive. Allied forces drove back the Germans, causing German morale to break down. By the fall, Germany was in retreat. Their allies, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, were starting to collapse. The home front collapses in Germany. While the battlefields worsened, things at home in Germany became dire. Hunger moved from the cities to the rural areas. Strikes and demonstrations broke out. Soldiers fighting on the front line disobeyed orders or deserted. The German fleet mutinied in October 1918, refusing to fight a hopeless last battle against the British. For ordinary Germans, the war was intolerable. Pressure built up on the Kaiser to step down, and revolution swept across the nation. A war of morale. In 1918, it wasn't weapons and numbers anymore that counted. It was morale. The Allies, though exhausted, now had something to hope for due to America's arrival. Germany, although bolstered by Russia's fall, now faced desperation as its citizens starved and its troops disintegrated. The contrast proved definitive. Wars are not won on the strength of weapons, but on the determination to keep going. By the late autumn of 1918, Germany had lost that determination. Why 1917 was the turning point. In retrospect, 1917 was the turning point. Russia's withdrawal released Germany, but left it complacent. America's entry introduced new troops, limitless supplies, and fresh energy. Germany's final gamble did not pay off, leaving Germany weaker than ever before. The Allies, while battered themselves, drew new strength and cohesion. The power balance had been changed. There was still no end to the war in sight, but for the very first time, there was a hope of victory for the Allies. The human side for civilians and soldiers, the turning point was not always evident at the time. To them 1917 and 1918 seemed more endless misery, but looking back, it was the point where the tide started rolling back. A French soldier wrote, "We are still dying by the thousands, but now perhaps there is a light beyond the horizon." An American soldier who came to France wrote, "The men here look tired beyond words. They see us and smile as if we are salvation itself." And a mother in Germany wrote in her diary, "We are promised victory is at hand, but we have no bread, no coal, no hope." The people no longer believe. These words recall that history's turning points are experienced not in great speeches, but in the hidden despair and hope of everyday lives. The road ahead. By December 1917, the last act of the Great War was ready to be played. The old European empires were crumbling, new states were emerging, the world was readying itself for a climax that would determine the destiny of millions. The war was not yet finished, but the trend was evident. By the beginning of 1918, 4 arduous years had already been spent fighting the war. The Western Front trenches seemed endless, and millions of lives had been taken for advances of a few yards. Troops were weary, civilians were hungry, politicians on both sides recognized the war could not go on indefinitely. Germany, on the other hand, perceived one final opportunity to emerge victorious. Since Russia was no longer in the war following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany did not have to fight on 2 fronts anymore. 500,000 German troops could be diverted west, but there was a caveat. America had joined the war. New American soldiers were landing in Europe each month, and their numbers were increasing rapidly. Germany was racing against time. If they could hit hard in 1918, before American strength fully came, they may be able to compel France and Britain to yield. This was the last gamble, the desperate emperor's final push. The Spring Offensive. Germany's gamble. Germany began the Spring Offensive or Kaiserschlacht des Jahres battle on March 21, 1918. The assault was unprecedented. The German artillery began with a massive bombardment that fired millions of shells in a matter of a few hours. The stormtroopers followed, elite units that jumped quickly, going around points of strength, infiltrating areas of weakness, and striking deep in enemy territory. At first it succeeded. The Allies were shocked. The German military pushed through British lines, driving them back by miles in a matter of days, something not seen since the early years of the conflict. For the first time, Paris itself was seemingly in danger. German shells even rained on the city, scaring civilians. Crowds were streaming out, and the French government was ready to evacuate. It seemed that Germany would finally win. The cost of success, but the Spring Offensive was accomplished at a horrific cost. Germany moved rapidly, but was unable to maintain its gains. Their lines of supply were stretched thin, food and ammunition did not keep pace, and troops grew tired. Worse, they lacked any definitive strategic objective. Rather than attack as a decisive force, they attacked in a number of directions, exhausting themselves without landing the knockout punch. The more territory Germany took, the harder it was to hold. By the summer of 1918, they were losing speed. The Allies, though battered, were not defeated. And then came the Americans in large numbers. The arrival of the Americans in mid-1918, the United States had deployed almost 2 million soldiers to Europe. Initially they served under British and French officers, but later they initiated their own offensives. The Americans were green but energetic and determined. Where British and French troops were exhausted after 4 years of fighting, the Americans were fresh, keen and fit. Their arrival lifted morale throughout the Allied forces. One American officer summed it up: "The French look at us as if we are a miracle, to them we are hope made flesh." The Second Battle of the Marne. Germany mounted a final attack in July 1918 during the Second Battle of the Marne. They sought to divide French troops and clear the way to Paris, but the Allies were prepared this time. Supported by the Americans, they turned back the attack. German troops were routed, with heavy casualties. For Germany it was the end of the illusion. Their final gamble had been unsuccessful. The 100 Days Offensive. Once the Marne, the initiative passed into the hands of the Allies. This followed, as the 100 Days Offensive, a continuous succession of assaults between August and November 1918 that at last ended the deadlock. In the Battle of Amiens in August, British, Canadian, Australian and French soldiers, backed by tanks and planes, broke through German defenses. General Ludendorff, Germany's best general, described it as the Black Day of the German army. The Allies advanced, taking land that had been occupied by Germany for years. Trenches once thought to be permanent were left behind. American troops tested themselves in battles such as Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where more than 1 million American troops fought. It was the biggest American campaign of the war, and although losses were enormous, their vast numbers overpowered German defenses. The Allies had at last discovered how to get their tanks, airplanes, artillery and infantry working together. Combined arms warfare, the 20th century style of fighting, was born. Germany's collapse. By the fall of 1918, Germany was collapsing. On the front, soldiers were tired, supplies running low and morale failing. Desertions mounted, whole units surrendered. German soldiers no longer thought there could be a victory. At sea, the German Navy also rebelled in late October, disobeying orders to embark on a last doomed mission against the British. Mutiny swept across the fleet, spreading into a national uprising. At home, civilians starved, bread was short, coal was depleted, and riots lined the streets. Industrial workers struck, revolution swept on, mirroring what had occurred in Russia a year earlier. On the 9th of November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II resigned and went into exile in the Netherlands. Germany became a republic. The collapse of the Central Powers. Germany's allies had already started to collapse. Bulgaria had surrendered in September 1918. The Ottoman Empire agreed to an armistice in October following losses in the Middle East.
Austria-Hungary broke up as various nationalities, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and others, set up independent states. By November, Austria-Hungary ceased to function as an empire. Germany stood alone, and it couldn't resist. The road to armistice with revolution at home and defeat on the front, Germany had no alternative but to turn to peace. Peace talks opened in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice began. The guns that had boomed for 4 years were finally silent. Soldiers from both sides emerged from trenches and gazed at each other across the devastated landscape, amazed that it was finally over. One British soldier wrote, "We could hear the silence. After years of thunder, the quiet was deafening." The human cost. The last push had been decisive, but had cost blood. The 100 Days offensive alone resulted in more than 1 million casualties. The American army had lost 26,000 men in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the most deadly battle in American history. For Germany, the cost had been catastrophic. Its army was shattered, its citizens starving, its empire lost. The war had not ended in victory, or even stalemate, but in complete exhaustion and collapse. Soldiers' voices, letters, and diaries preserved the odd feelings of the last months. A French soldier wrote, "We march forward every day not in hope of glory, but to finish this nightmare." An American private wrote, "We are green, we are young, but we will see it through. The old world looks at us and sees salvation. That is a heavy burden." A German soldier had this to say, "We no longer fight for Germany, we fight to survive one more day. The war has consumed everything." These words remind us that behind every advance and counterattack were human beings, weary but still standing. The legacy of the final push. The history of 1918 demonstrated that wars are not always won by genius or one battle, sometimes they are won by perseverance. Germany's spring offensive was aggressive, but went too far. The Allies' 100 Days offensive was relentless, methodical, and backed by sheer numbers. Ultimately, Germany was not able to counter the combined forces of Britain, France, America, and their allies. The final assault brought the war to an end, but left the world wounded. More than 20 million individuals were killed, empires had been destroyed, and a generation had been lost. The conflict was over, but the peace would come hard. The seeds of future conflict were already planted. The end of the combat, not the end of the book. On November 11th, the troops celebrated, but many cried. They had come through what had appeared as incomprehensible, but they took with them wounds that would never heal, memories of trenches, of shells, of the endless rows of the dead. The war was at an end, the world was irrevocably altered, but the peace that ensued would be just as tempestuous as the war itself. After over 4 years of mud, blood, and thunder, the Great War was at last grinding toward its end. By November 1918, the Central Powers were falling one by one. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary had already fallen. Germany alone remained, weary, famished, and shattered. The once formidable German army, which had pushed so defiantly in the spring, was now falling back under unrelenting Allied pressure. Back home, the streets were filled with demonstrations. Factory workers called for food. Soldiers would not fight, the navy mutinied. Revolution swept across the nation, compelling Kaiser Wilhelm II to relinquish his throne on November 9. He escaped into exile in the Netherlands. There was now just one question remaining: how would it all end? The road to Compiègne. Germany realized it had no alternative but to accept peace, but the Allies, mindful of not repeating the inconclusive endings of earlier wars, insisted on unconditional surrender. Negotiators assembled in a railway wagon in the Compiègne forest in northern France, out of the public eye. On November 8, a German delegation, headed by politician Matthias Erzberger, came to negotiate. In front of them stood Marshal Ferdinand Foch, commanding general of the Allied forces. The Germans were weary, their uniforms tattered, their cheeks sunken. They implored mercy, but the Allies were unyielding. The conditions were severe. Germany was required to evacuate occupied territories, submit to weapons and equipment disarmament, liberate prisoners, and allow Allied occupation of the Rhineland. There was no room to negotiate. The Germans complained of the harsh terms, but Volk would not be moved. 4 years Europe had suffered. The victors now insisted that the guarantee be made that Germany would not recover at once. After days of strained negotiations, the Germans consented. The armistice was signed on the morning of November 11, 1918. The fighting would cease at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month. The last hours until that moment came, however. The war continued raging on. Under the early morning shadows of November 11th, troops on both sides kept fighting, unaware or unsuspicious of what awaited them. Cannons thundered, machine guns chattered, men died in no man's land, just as they had done for years. The bitter irony was that thousands would be killed on the very last day of the war, some in attacks launched just hours, even minutes, before the armistice went into effect. In all, more than 2,000 men were killed on November 11th alone. For the soldiers at the front, word of peace traveled fast. Troops whispered among themselves that it could all be over any moment now, but no one had the nerve to believe it completely. Too many times hopes had been dashed. The 11th hour, it occurred at 11 a.m. The guns fell quiet. The thunder that had convulsed Europe for 4 years suddenly ceased. Troops emerged from trenches, dazed by the stillness. Birds sang once more. Men stared at each other across no man's land, cheering and weeping. Others just sat, motionless, trying to take in the sudden stop. One of the British officers wrote, "At 11 o'clock the roar stopped. We gazed at one another in wonder. After years of hell, there was only silence. It was the silence of death, and of peace." Church bells rang for the first time in cities and towns throughout Europe. People flooded into the streets. In Paris, London and New York, women danced, hugged and cried with happiness. Flags fluttered, bands marched, and strangers hugged one another with jubilation. Reactions across nations. The armistice was greeted very differently based on the place from which you were coming. In Belgium and France, liberation was celebrated. Villages that had been under German control for years jubilated as Allied troops marched in. Families were reunited. Survivors held on to hope of repairing their broken lives. In Britain, London celebrated. Prime Minister David Lloyd George read out, "At 11 o'clock this morning came to an end, the cruelest and most terrible war that has ever scourged mankind." In America, while the war had affected them less personally, there were celebrations in cities from sea to sea. President Woodrow Wilson declared November 11th to be a day of remembrance. In Germany, there was somber mood. To many soldiers and civilians, the armistice was less than a victory for peace, and rather more a badge of humiliation. They had battled courageously for years, and now they were instructed to put down their weapons, to capitulate without triumph. The stab in the back legend, the untrue belief that Germany was not beaten on the battlefield, but backstabbed by politicians at home, started taking hold. This legend would have deadly implications in the coming years. The human cost, even as humans rejoiced. The harsh truth of the war's toll was crushing. More than 20 million individuals were killed, soldiers and civilians. Towns were completely destroyed. Millions of men came home maimed, blinded or limbless. Psychological wounds, what was then referred to as shell shock, troubled countless survivors. For those families who had lost their loved ones, the armistice tasted bitter. It meant no more slaughter, but it also meant that the men they had patiently waited for would never return home. In villages throughout Europe, bells of peace tolled simultaneously with bells of mourning. Soldiers' voices, letters and diaries record the emotional richness of the day. A French soldier penned, "The silence is peculiar, nearly terrifying. We have existed with death hanging over us for 4 years, now it is gone, yet it is unreal." An American private noted, "The war is finished, I am alive. That is all I can manage to think. Alive, so many are not." A German soldier admitted, "We do not celebrate, we march home in defeat. The war has ended, but for us, life has ended too." The voices of the survivors remind us that the armistice was not only history, but human experience, the symbol of the 11th hour, the armistice timing, the 11th hour, of the 11th day, of the 11th month, soon assumed symbolic significance. It was a moment of reverence, a commemoration that even in the midst of turmoil, human beings yearned for order, ritual, and closure. After the war years, November 11th was remembered across the globe. In Britain and the Commonwealth, it came to be known as Remembrance Day. In the United States, it was originally Armistice Day, which was later changed to Veterans Day. In France, ceremonies at the Arc de Triomphe commemorated the unknown soldier. The public fell silent for 2 minutes at 11 a.m. every year to honor the sacrifice of the millions. The day after peace, the armistice made war cease, but suffering did not end. Troops embarked on their long journey home with visible and invisible wounds. Refugees returned to devastated villages, where houses were nothing but ruins and fields were no more than wastelands. The world celebrated peace, but also asked what now. The Treaty of Versailles, signed later in June 1919, would try to provide that answer, but by doing so, it would be planting the seeds for future war. The legacy of the armistice. The old world of monarchs and empires had ceased to exist. The new world, forged in industry, nationalism, and mass mobilization, had been born. The 11th hour silence represented not only relief but also loss of innocence, of generations of belief in the splendor of war. One British nurse recorded in her diary, "We prayed for peace, it has come, but nothing will ever be the same again." A world changed forever, as soldiers dropped their guns and civilians thronged the streets. The world was at a crossroads. The Great War had ended, but its shadow fell long. Nations celebrated, grieved and recovered. Children grew up in a world informed by the sacrifices of their parents. The armistice was peace, but it was temporary, a tenuous truce that would continue only for 2 decades before the world succumbed to an even larger disaster. But on this day in November 1918, for the first time in 4 years, the guns fell silent, and in the silence there was hope. When at last the guns ceased on November 11, 1918, the world sighed relief. 4 years of unimagined horror had passed, and millions thought that humanity had learned its lesson at last. Leaders vowed that this was the war to end all wars, but the aftermath of World War I was much more nuanced. The war concluded, yes, but it left broken nations, shattered societies and festering wounds that would never heal. The subsequent peace did not bring stability, rather it planted the seeds of another even more destructive conflict. Barely 2 decades later, the Treaty of Versailles, peace or punishment. The war's most direct legacy was the Treaty of Versailles, which in June 1919 was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, outside Paris. The treaty was intended to end the war, but it ended up being one of the most contentious documents in history. The Allies, and especially France, insisted that Germany pay for the war. After all, Germany had invaded France and Belgium, and left ruinous destruction in its wake. The terms of the treaty were punitive. Germany was required to take the blame for having caused the war, the notorious war guilt clause. It was compelled to make huge reparations in billions of dollars. Its army was downsized to a small fraction of what it had been, and there were severe restrictions on weapons and soldiers. It was forced to cede colonies and territories. such as Alsace-Lorraine back to France, and the majority of its overseas empire. Areas of Germany were occupied by the Allies. To the French, the treaty was justice. To the British, it was a necessary protection, but for the Germans it was humiliation. To many they felt that the terms were not peace but punishment. This bitterness seethed, creating extremist movements that swore revenge. Among them was Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who later used the fury over Versailles to come to power. The collapse of empires. World War I reduced four great empires. The German Empire fell with the resignation of Kaiser Wilhelm II. In his stead emerged the Weimar Republic, a weak democracy that grappled with economic crises, political extremism, and bitterness about Versailles. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into independent countries, Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia. A centuries-old empire had broken overnight. The Ottoman Empire also fell apart. Its Middle Eastern territories were partitioned by Britain and France through the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. New nations such as Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon were formed, but under foreign mandate, fomenting the tensions that echo to this very day. The Russian Empire had already collapsed in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. Following this was years of civil war, concluding in the establishment of the Soviet Union, a communist nation that would redefine international politics. The world map was reconfigured, but in ways which produced as many issues as they resolved. New nations, old tensions in Eastern Europe, new nations emerged: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These countries were jubilant at their independence but also had problems. Borders were created in a rush, so they mixed different ethnic groups within states. Poland, for instance, acquired land from Germany, Austria, and Russia, but had its boundaries disputed by all three. Czechoslovakia joined Czechs and Slovaks, but had extensive German and Hungarian minorities. The Balkans continued to be an assortment of conflicting nationalisms, still volatile even after the war. The doctrine of self-determination, which was advocated by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, was selectively used. Europeans were awarded new states, while Asian and African colonies were not granted independence. This double standard created fuel for future movements towards independence. The human cost aside from politics, the war bequeathed a human legacy of sorrow and suffering. Casualties: more than 20 million killed and 21 million injured. A whole generation of young males was destroyed. In Britain, every village in the land lost its sons. In France, nearly a quarter of all men between 18 and 30 never came home. Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary lost equally. Psychological trauma: those who survived carried intangible scars. What we refer to today as PTSD was referred to as shell shock. Men shook like leaves, experienced nightmares, or could not speak. Society was not always aware of their pain, and many were left to fight in silence. Orphans and widows, families numbering millions, were shattered. Orphans were brought up by non-married women. Memorials were erected by the communities to the dead, within town squares being crowded with rolls of names carved into stone. The war did not leave only physical destruction, but emotional destruction too. Technology and war. World War I was also a revolution in technology. It introduced tanks, airplanes, and submarines as prominent weapons of warfare. It demonstrated the power of destruction of machine guns, poison gas, and artillery. It merged the civilian and military targets with home fronts bombed by air raids and blockaded by navies. The world learned from the war that modern industry had the capacity to kill on a level unimaginable. Humanity went into the 20th century thinking technology equated progress. It emerged from the war having understood that technology could also signify destruction. The role of women. Perhaps the greatest social legacy of the war was the role of women. With men fighting up front, women were employed in factories, offices and farms. They became nurses, drivers, and even soldiers in a few nations. They showed that women could perform the tasks traditionally performed by men. Women in a number of countries were granted the right to vote after the war. In Britain, women above the age of 30 were given the right to vote in 1918. Women gained suffrage in the United States in 1920. The war did not bring gender equality but hastened progress, and sowed seeds for the feminist movements of the 20th century. Art, literature, and memory. The war had a tremendous impact on culture. Poets, writers, and artists grappled with the enormity of the horror. The lost generation of young men such as Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Erich Maria Remarque penned incendiary descriptions of the trenches, laying bare the senselessness of war. Owen's chilling poem Dulce et Decorum est condemned as the old lie, the notion of being killed for one's country. Artists pushed the boundaries of new forms such as Dadaism and Surrealism that echoed the turmoil and folly of the times. Cemeteries and memorials dotted the European landscape, with sea upon sea of white crosses. For civilians and survivors, memory was holy. Ceremonies were held on November 11th every year to honor the dead. The poppy, born of the poem in Flanders Fields, symbolized memory. Political upheaval. The war also remade world politics. The United States became a great world power. Although it retreated into isolation in the 1920s, its role could no longer be neglected.
The Soviet Union was the first communist nation, overthrowing the old order and spreading revolutions across the globe. Colonial subjects who fought for European powers returned home seeking rights and freedom, sowing seeds of anti-colonial resistance. The world was no longer focused on Europe alone. A new, more international balance of power was emerging. The illusion of peace hopes were in vain. The heritage of World War I was not enduring peace. The Treaty of Versailles engendered resentment in Germany, instability in Eastern Europe, and outrage in colonies deprived of independence. Economic crises, such as the Great Depression of the 1930s, worsened these ills. Rather than averting future war, the war had set the stage for another. Within a span of 20 years, the world would once again be plunged into world war, a far more lethal one. Voices of reflection. Modern voices remind us of the bittersweet feelings following the war. A French widow penned, "Peace has come, but my house is empty. What is peace without him?" A German veteran stated, "We are told we lost the war, but in truth, we lost our youth, our hope, our tomorrow." An American soldier back home had this to say, "We fought to make the world safe for democracy. I only hope my son will not have to do the same." These words ring out throughout history, reminding us that wars are not merely about treaties, but about lives forever changed. The legacy today, over 100 years on, World War I's legacy continues to define our world. Post-1918 borders still determine European and Middle Eastern politics. The war's memory exists in monuments, literature, and nationality. The war made humanity grapple with issues we continue to struggle with today. How do we balance peace with security? How do we commemorate the dead without glorifying war? How do we make sure that such devastation never recurs? Conclusion: the war to end all wars. Ultimately, the Great War was not the war to end all wars. It was the war that revealed how easily peace could be broken. It ended empires, reshaped societies, and left scarring on generations. The silence of the 11th of November, 1918, was not the end of history. It was a lull, a tenuous breath between two storms. But it was also a reminder of the price of pride, of competition, of hatred. A reminder that behind every signature on an agreement, behind every statistic on a kill report, there are people, each with a story, each with a life shortened or forever altered. The history of World War I is not only recorded in books, it is recorded in graves, in memories, in the fabric of the contemporary world.